WILLIE, the global currency reset has begun, with many sides, all in progress. The United States has 3 requirements in returning to the gold standard. They will be extremely difficult to achieve. They each serve as essential requirements in a criterion. All 3 are urgently needed. The challenge is formidable for the nation to remain as a leading player in the global economy. The United States stands alone in volume of national debt. Many place the blame on the social net like welfare, social security, and other measures. However, the biggest element is clearly the military budget, hardly for defense in the last 2 decades. As CEO Jack Ma of Alibaba stated so succinctly, the US government has spent $25 trillion on the military with nothing to show for it except decayed infrastructure and global animosity for its aggression. A major item in recent years for the deficits has been Medicare, which is full of fraud and waste. Another major item is the raft of pensions like for government service, judicial service, and military service. Requirements for the gold standard eliminate the $21 trillion US government deficit, source 10,000 tons gold to support the currency, reindustrialize to work down $600 billion trade deficit. Back in 2017, US President Trump commissioned a study to verify the status of the US gold reserves. He and Vice President Pence, who led the study, were shocked to learn that the Fort Knox gold had been stolen. Of course, such a discovery never reaches the national news in broadcast or printed form. Thus the long delay in any conceivable effort to set up the $1 trillion infrastructure program promised during his campaign for office. The gears switched to locating and rescuing the stolen gold, with dirty fingers identified for ex-presidents Papa Bush and Bill Clinton, along with the Wall Street crowd of criminals led by Robert Rubin. Rumors are ripe that the gold has been recovered, which also never reaches the controlled news networks. The eager await confirmation. Are we going to see a global currency reset? The case for something like a global currency reset is interesting, and harks back to the darkest financial days of recent times. In 2008, as the world economy was teetering on the edge of the abyss, thoughts were moving towards how this situation could have occurred and how to prevent this occurrence in the future. Recently I read an article discussing the inevitability of a global currency reevaluation and reset. For most observers and even many traders, the first questions that comes to mind is not the merits or failings of such an issue, but something much more fundamental. What is a global currency reset? There is a reason that most people are not familiar with the concept. That is because it is something that has rarely been used in recent history. Only once in the last 100 years, after World War II, with the fear of another Great Depression in the air and a note of conciliation in the collective minds of politicians the world over, at the famous Bretton Woods Conference, was this achieved. It was effective in preventing another depression, and in fact, the years post-World War II saw strong economic recovery as the world recovered from its wartime slump and industry exploded. It was also a unique confluence of circumstances. The world had been decimated by war, and countries had come together collectively to fight a common enemy. It was the last time that much of the world had stopped thinking exclusively about sovereign interests and banded together for international goals. The lives of foreign nationals became important, and armies fought for and protected the lands of their neighbors. Politicians had become used to thinking about the interests of their allies. This alone made it a unique time in history for collaborative action and collaborative will. The reason this is relevant is because a global currency reset is where all the nations, or at least a vast majority, agree to one currency standard, like gold, for example. The critical factor is agreement between countries, which is only ever achieved when the needs and interests of those countries are aligned. The case for something like a global currency reset is interesting, and harks back to the darkest financial days of recent times. In 2008, as the world economy was teetering on the edge of the abyss, thoughts were moving towards how this situation could have occurred and how to prevent this occurrence in the future. The leaders of the world wanted to create a situation where irresponsible activities in another country did not destroy their economy. Post-Bretton Woods, the main reserve currency held by countries was the US dollar, yet another reason that worldwide financial issues were so encompassing. Would a reset be the solution? Ultimately, the world did not go that way. Post-World War II was a unique time, where not only was there a global consensus but also mutual interest. Post-2008, the mutual interest was lacking. The simple fact that some countries would have benefited less from a global reset, meant that it would take significant political will to undermine this element. To surrender control of monetary policy because of the failures of another country would be unthinkable politically. Resets would limit the ability of central banks, a major point of friction that is playing out in Europe. Not to mention the fighting that would arise amongst countries trying to set the new standard. Just think of the varying positions and interests of Russia, China, and the USA and you can imagine how easily this would be solved. Is the world likely to see another global currency reset? Honestly, it would take a worldwide disaster the level of World War II to bring together the world for a reset. So if a reset does become a reality, we can probably agree that it is likely to be the least of our problems. The global currency reset, Ian Hannaford. There is a lot of discussion about the global currency reset. Some people believe that it is a mysterious council, riding around on magic carpets that is somehow in control of the entire world's gold reserve. Not only is that completely untrue, but how would they get all of the world's gold on their flying carpets? Yes, there will be a global currency reset because the central banks have created a lot of debt and manipulated all of the markets, in preparation of their new world order. One world currency. In 1933, America's financial system was hijacked by a group of bankers. The Federal Reserve Act was founded and the corruption began. All stock market crashes has been strategically orchestrated in the preparation of world domination. The truth about the global currency reset is actually very simple, when you pay attention to certain events that has brought us here. All major financial institutions are owned by the same people. They have been given clever names to fool the public into thinking, one is above the other. When you understand that the Federal Reserve, central banks, and International Monetary Fund are all the same small group of people, it will become clearer. This small group of bankers have manipulated the entire globe. When it is said that China holds the majority of America's debt, that simply means that the Central Bank of China loaned America money. Now what many don't realize is, the Central Bank of China and the Central Bank in America are the same banks. They are just given different names to keep the fear going. In an attempt to usher in the New World Order, the entire world had to be put into debt. That is the reason that war is a necessity. When countries are at war, the same banking institutions funds both sides of the war, all while issuing more debt out of thin air. Countries had to be invaded, leaders had to be killed that wouldn't cooperate. In 2008 during the Great Recession, the American public was sold on of the biggest lies of all times. When you sit back and really listen to what was actually said, the more angry you become. What was really said is, we as bankers came up with a scheme to capture all of America's assets and make the unsuspecting public slaves. We are going to drain your pension funds. Foreclose on your houses and rent them back to you. Transfer all of the high-paying factory jobs overseas and leave Americans to compete with illegal aliens for the jobs that are left, so we can pay a lower wage. Requiring smaller banks to hold a certain amount of funds that was impossible for them, so they had to be taken over by the larger institutions, creating banks that are considered too big to fail. Printing an amount of currency that will guarantee hyperinflation when all of the currency hits the system, basically, leaving America and the rest of the world in ruins. The 2016 presidential election changed everything. With the election of President Donald Trump, it changed all of the globalists' plans and turned the tables in a major way. The elites have always controlled the world using America's military. America has always had a presidential selection dressed up as an election. The elites now have banks that has overprinted all currency, an American president that have the support of the world's greatest military, that the elites can't control. They are in trouble. The world's economy is crashing fast and elites are not in control. With the executive order on human rights abuses, it gives the Treasury Department permission to freeze and confiscate the assets of anyone committing human rights abuses or corruption. That executive order is nothing but a worldwide RICO Act, that other world leaders have agreed to. With that executive order, the Federal Reserve and central banks in America becomes property of the United States Treasury Department. President Trump will declare all of America's debt fraudulent and will have no other choice but to erase it all. Majority of the loans were created using fractional reserve banking, meaning the banks have been making loans on money they didn't have. If you or I did that, we would be arrested. Now here is the interesting part. When President Trump was elected, his net worth was roughly $4 billion. That $4 billion consists of a small amount of cash and a lot of assets that have mortgages on them. After the debt is wiped clean, all of his assets become free and clear. The currency will have to be replaced with a new currency. The new currency will be printed by the Treasury Department, with Congress determining how much is needed to run the country. Most of the entitlement will be eliminated. The president only made promises to 3 groups of people, and they were the veterans, elderly and the disabled. If you don't fit into any of those categories, I suggest you start looking for a job. Share with your friends.